Nobody in Colby County, Georgia could quite explain why 55-year-old Coley Whitfield had started walking her family's peach orchard alone every morning before sunrise, eyes closed, stopping every few rows to stand perfectly still and listen. Not to music, not to a phone, to the wind moving through the branches, to the particular way it rustled differently in one section of the orchard than another. She carried a notebook and a pencil, and after each stop, she'd write something down without ever opening her eyes to check the page. Her neighbors thought grief had finally caught up with her. Her husband Thaddeus had lost his sight 7 years earlier, and folks in Colby County figured maybe Coley had started walking blind herself out of some strange sympathy, or worse, that the stress of running 40 acres of peach trees alone while caring for a blind husband had simply worn her down into something people were too polite to name outright. By the 3rd week of May, half the county had heard about Coley's listening walks, and most of them said it the way you'd describe something a little sad, a little worrying. Nobody laughed exactly, but nobody took it seriously either. Not until the sky over Colby County turned the color of a fresh bruise on a Tuesday afternoon in June. If stories about quiet determination, unexpected wisdom, and the things people overcome on working farmland matter to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story means something to you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find the people who care about stories like Coley's. Now let's find out what she was actually listening for, and what it ended up saving. Colby County sits in the rolling clay hills of Middle Georgia, in the heart of the state's peach country, where the soil runs a deep reddish-orange and the summer air hangs thick and sweet with ripening fruit by early June. The Whitfield family had farmed the same 40 acres for 3 generations, growing Alberta and Red Haven peaches on gently sloping ground that caught the morning sun early and held the heat late into the afternoon. Thaddeus Whitfield had run the orchard alongside his father as a young man and had taken it over fully in his 30s, building a modest but respected operation that supplied fruit stands and a regional grocery chain across 3 counties. He lost his vision gradually over the better part of 2 years, a complication of diabetes he'd managed for most of his adult life, until by the time he turned 52, the world had gone entirely dark. He did not stop farming. He simply farmed differently, learning to navigate the rows by memory and touch, relying on Coley to describe what he could no longer see, the color of the ripening fruit, the condition of the leaves, the shape of clouds building on the horizon. Coley had married into the orchard at 26, a schoolteacher's daughter who'd never expected to spend her life among peach trees, and she'd learned the work the way most farm spouses do, gradually, out of necessity, and eventually out of genuine devotion to the land itself. After Thaddeus lost his sight, something in her changed. She began narrating the world to him constantly, out of habit and love, describing not just what she saw but what she heard, the particular creak of a branch under fruit weight, the different pitch of wind moving through young growth versus mature canopy, the way certain birds nested in some rows and avoided others entirely. Without ever setting out to do it, Coley had spent 7 years training her own ears the way most people train their eyes. She began to notice, first without quite realizing she was noticing, that the orchard did not sound the same everywhere. Some rows carried wind in a low, steady hush. Others rattled and snapped in gusts that seemed sharper, more sudden, more violent, even on days when the weather elsewhere in the county seemed calm. The spring Coley turned 55, Colby County endured a string of severe thunderstorms that dropped golf ball-sized hail across parts of 3 neighboring farms in April, stripping leaves and bruising fruit on exposed rows while leaving other sections of the same orchards almost untouched. Coley had stood at her own orchard's edge during one of those storms, eyes closed out of old habit, and noticed something that stayed with her long after the hail stopped. The sound of the storm hitting her trees wasn't uniform. It came in waves, louder and harder in some rows, muffled and softer in others, in a pattern that seemed to repeat itself no matter which direction the wind was blowing from that particular afternoon. She mentioned it to Thaddeus that evening. He didn't dismiss it, though he admitted he couldn't picture what she meant well enough to say if it made sense. "Ask Otis," he told her. "If anybody in this county knows why wind does what it does over a piece of ground, it's Otis Vance." Otis Vance was 78, a retired agricultural extension meteorologist who'd spent 31 years studying how weather moved across farmland in the southeast before retiring to a small house at the edge of town. He agreed to walk the orchard with Coley on a Saturday morning in May, and he did something she hadn't expected. He didn't just talk. He listened alongside her, standing quietly at each stop while she described what she was hearing in her own words. By the third stop, Otis had a name for what Coley had been noticing without knowing it. "You're standing in a wind shadow," he told her, "at a row near the orchard's northeastern corner, sheltered by a rise in the land and a stand of older, taller trees along the property line. Storm wind doesn't move across ground evenly. It bends around terrain, gets blocked by tree lines, speeds up where there's nothing in its way and slows down where there is. Hail doesn't fall straight down in a storm like that. Wind drives it in at an angle. If something's standing between the wind and your trees, a ridge, a windbreak, even a dense stand of taller growth, the hail hits at a shallower angle and does less damage. You've been listening to your way into a wind map, Mrs. Whitfield, whether you meant to or not." Coley began keeping the notebook the following week. Every morning before sunrise, while the orchard was quiet enough to hear clearly, she walked the rows with her eyes closed, standing at intervals to note the character of the wind in each section, the pitch, the steadiness, the way it built or dropped as she moved from row to row. She cross-referenced what she heard against the terrain Otis had helped her understand: the low ridge along the northeast boundary, the dense old windbreak trees her husband's grandfather had planted decades earlier along the west fence line, the open, exposed stretch of younger trees on the south slope that caught wind from every direction with nothing to slow it down. It was not, by any measure, quick or easy work. Twice that May, Coley misjudged a section badly, marking a row as sheltered that turned out, during a moderate storm later that month, to catch wind just as hard as the exposed ground nearby. She went back to those rows afterward, standing through the tail end of storms she probably should have been sheltering from herself, correcting her notes, refining what she thought she understood. Her neighbor Dale Ferris, who farmed the pecan orchard adjoining the Whitfield property, watched her from his own fence line more than once that spring. "Coley Whitfield's out there walking her trees blindfolded," he told his wife one evening, not unkindly, but with the particular concern people express about something they don't understand. "I don't know if she's taken up meditating or if the stress finally got to her." His wife, Marjorie, who'd known Coley since grade school, said she doubted it was either, but admitted she wasn't sure what else to call it. At the feed store in town, the story took on a life of its own the way these things do in small counties. Somebody said Coley Whitfield had started talking to her trees. Somebody else said she was trying to hear the weather coming the way old-timers used to claim they could feel rain in their joints. Nobody quite got it right, and nobody asked her directly, which suited Coley fine. She kept walking, kept listening, kept writing in a notebook that, by early June, held a rough but increasingly confident map of the orchard's hidden wind patterns, section by section, row by row. Thaddeus never doubted what she was doing, though he couldn't have explained it to a neighbor any better than she could. He trusted her ears the way farmers trust instruments they've come to rely on over years of use. When she read her growing map aloud to him in the evenings, describing which rows sat deep in wind shadow and which stood exposed on open ground, he listened the way he'd once studied soil reports, quietly, seriously, filing the information away. The storm came on the second Tuesday of June, building fast out of the southwest in a way the local forecast had only partially anticipated, upgraded from a routine thunderstorm watch to a severe warning within the span of 40 minutes as radar showed rapidly strengthening rotation and hail cores forming well ahead of the main line. Coley had been out walking the orchard that morning as usual and had noticed, without needing Otis to tell her why, that the wind already carried a strange, charged stillness in the exposed south rows, the kind of quiet that usually meant something was about to change. She and Thaddeus moved what equipment they could under cover and retreated to the house as the sky darkened. The hail hit Colby County hard that afternoon, larger stones than April's storm, some reported at nearly 2 inches across, driven by wind gusts the National Weather Service later clocked at over 60 miles an hour. Across the county, orchards and row crops alike took heavy damage. Dale Ferris lost close to a third of his pecan crop on the exposed western edge of his property. A cotton field 2 farms over was flattened almost entirely. The regional grocery chain's other peach suppliers reported losses well above 50% on exposed acreage. On the Whitfield farm, the damage was not uniform, and it followed almost precisely the map Coley had spent 6 weeks building by ear. The exposed south slope, the young trees with nothing to slow the wind, took heavy losses, stripped leaves, bruised and split fruit. Several young limbs snapped outright. But the rows along the sheltered northeast rise and behind the old windbreak on the west fence line came through with only minor damage. Fruit intact, canopy largely undisturbed. Exactly as Otis Vance had predicted a wind shadow should behave. When the storm passed and Coley walked the orchard that evening, describing the damage to Thaddeus row by row the way she described every storm and every harvest to him for 7 years, she realized her sheltered sections held nearly 70% of the farm's total fruit yield for the season, salvaged almost entirely because she'd known, before the storm arrived, exactly where to concentrate their limited protective measures and where the loss was simply unavoidable. Dale Ferris came by 3 days later, walking the fence line between their properties slowly, looking at the difference between his own stripped western rows and the largely intact Whitfield trees just beyond them. "I heard you'd mapped this whole orchard out by ear," he said, somewhere between a question and an accusation. Coley told him it was true, and walked him through it the way Otis had walked her through it months earlier, standing at the boundary between exposed ground and wind shadow, explaining what her ears had learned to recognize before anyone had given her a name for it. By the following spring, Dale had asked Coley and Otis to help him identify similar wind shadow zones on his own property before replanting his damaged pecan rows. The county extension office, hearing about it through the kind of conversation that travels fast at the feed store, asked Coley to speak at a regional meeting on storm-resilient orchard layout that fall. She agreed on the condition that Thaddeus sit beside her on the stage, which he did, listening the way he always had, filing away every detail of a room he could no longer see. Coley never made much of what happened that June. When people asked how she'd known which rows would hold, she usually said the same simple thing. She hadn't known, not with certainty, only that 7 years of describing the world to a man who couldn't see it had taught her to hear things most people walk past without noticing at all. She kept her notebook in the kitchen drawer that winter, already sketching, before the ground even thawed, where the next season's careful listening should begin. There's a particular kind of knowledge that only comes from paying close attention to something for reasons that have nothing to do with the knowledge itself. Coley Whitfield hadn't set out to map her orchard's hidden weather patterns. She'd set out years earlier, simply to make sure her husband never felt shut out of the world around him. In doing that, quietly, patiently, one described sunset and one narrated storm at a time, she built an understanding of her own land that no instrument in the county could have given her. And when the sky finally turned dangerous, it was that understanding, not luck, that saved the greater part of a season's harvest.